Well, I'm delighted to be here, and it's a huge honour to meet all of you, all our friends, and thank you, Baroness Werner, and Your Royal Highness for bringing so much kind of authority and spotlight onto this event, which is so important. So I wanted to start by introducing Sarah Woodcock, who is, well, you run the Anti-Slavery Collective. Now this is a huge issue across the Commonwealth and across the world, in fact, and we're going to find out from Sarah how big it is, how big a challenge, and what we're all going to do about it. Right, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you once again to the host, to Lalita, to Rupert, to Baroness Verma, and thank you, Emily, for joining me. I first of all must say I represent the Anti-Slavery Collective, which was a charity actually started by the sister of somebody in this room. So Princess Eugenie and a great friend of hers, Julia de Boinville, started the Anti-Slavery Collective in 2017 after a visit to India, where they happened to meet some survivors of commercial sexual exploitation, and were so astounded by the degradation and the abuse of women, their age, that they just felt absolutely compelled to do something about it, and spent 7 or 8 years passionately learning everything they could about this issue. Came to the realization that modern slavery, it's modern, it's slavery, it's happening right now in the UK very conservatively. It's estimated there are 130,000 people living in modern slavery.
That's just in this country, 130,000.
Just in that country, and that's very conservative.
How do we even know that?
Well, data is a major problem for modern slavery because it is by definition hidden and secretive and illegal, and it takes place in the shadows. So it's very challenging to collect data, but there are mechanisms. So there's the national referral mechanism. So most of our figures come from this mechanism that came out of the Modern Slavery Act, which is just about to celebrate its 10th year next year. This was a really landmark piece of legislation that has really informed legislation in other countries around the world. And through the establishment of the national referral mechanism, there is now a way of you suspect anybody in your community, in your area of being a victim of modern slavery, you can report them straight to the national referral mechanism or the police. Either one works.
So are you saying that in this room, and I was going to come to this at the end actually, but having had all this talk about what are we going to do about these things, how can we challenge or try and do something about that 130,000 people?
So one of our goals as an organisation is to create the right conditions for society to comprehensively reject modern slavery and human trafficking. But for us to be able to do that, society needs to know that it is happening. Right. And I think that's where the big juncture is.
Right, exactly. So this is where your organisation comes in, because you've got an overview. There are lots of people campaigning on slavery, there are lots of different groups in different areas. There are domestic servitude groups, there are forced labour groups. Tell us how you bring it all together and try and get a sense of scale.
Well, I mean, it is a giant global complex crime, and it is an economic crime. I think as an organisation we frame it in the sense that it is an economic crime that has profound human rights abuse attached to it. And I think when you're thinking about economic crime, and that's why it's so relevant to the discussions here about the Commonwealth. It's connected to what's happening in India, what's happening in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in London. Everything is connected when it comes to the movement and transfer and exploitation of
it's
people.
It's an international market, and we all countries, well, this country, I think you're saying, is a source and a place of trafficking.
It's a source, transit and end place for trafficking.
That's quite a sobering thought to think of that.
And if you look at the numbers in the UK at the moment, the second most trafficked nationality in the UK is people from the UK. And I think that is something that's quite difficult to understand, but that is people in the UK, vulnerable people, who are trafficked from city to city, who are forced to sell drugs, who are forced into commercial sexual exploitation, who are forced into domestic servitude or forced labour. So it is a problem that is affecting ordinary people in the UK right now.
And what's feeding it? Why? I mean, is it growing? Okay, is this whole phenomenon of slavery growing?
Yes.
And what's feeding it then?
It's very challenging to know. I think the way that we frame it, as I said, we're talking about it as an economic crime. The sharp end of the demand for cheap and exploitative labour is the consumer. I think the culture of consumerism is driving this demand for very, very cheap products, cheap clothes, fast fashion, cheap technology, and I think that's an area that we particularly focus on, forced labour, that, everybody in this room is connected to modern slavery, whether they like it or not, through everything that you buy and wear and do. There are risk areas. Tantalum, which is a component in every single person's phone, is mined in extremely exploitative conditions, often with children. So it's something that we're all connected to, and we don't necessarily know that.
So how can we use the power of the consumer? I mean, as you say, knowledge is the first thing, isn't it? I mean, we see scandals about certain big brands, don't they, exploiting labour in Bangladesh or wherever. I mean, is it just that there's so much more we just don't know about?
I think there needs to be better information. I think if people demanded information from brands, like, we're now kind of, Gen Z are the most kind of progressive and demanding consumer in the world. But I think we need to demand more from brands. These big global companies need to show us that their products are not produced off the back of extremely vulnerable people or exploited labour.
Okay, so there's quite a powerful corporate role then in tackling, because you're really trying to tackle the root causes, aren't you? I mean, we can all agree that it's terrible, but how do you tackle the factors that are feeding it?
I think having a really strong legal framework is always the starting point. And I think we have that in the UK. And I think there needs to be some tweaks made to it. But I think broadly speaking, the instrument is already there. And I think countries around the world are also using the Modern Slavery Act to develop their own legal framework. So I think that's it's the first step. You've then got enforcement, because trafficking is an economic crime and traffickers are entrepreneurs. And I think there has to be an investment in enforcement. But I think if we're looking at the root causes, it's always the same. People are tricked or deceived or forced into modern slavery because they need a job. It always comes down to work. They need a livelihood and they need money. And because of their vulnerability, they're forced to make riskier or more dangerous decisions about how they get that job. So I think if we're really talking about long-term change, it has to be in education and economic opportunities.
And when you meet, and presumably you meet quite a lot of people who have been forced into some kind of slavery, what do they say about the methods that were used? I mean, a lot of it, as you say, is deception. They just didn't think. They came thinking they were coming to some good job in Britain or somewhere else, and then were trapped.
Yeah, and often I think lots of people struggle when they think about modern slavery. Well, why didn't you leave? You weren't in chains. You weren't, you weren't locked behind a door.
You just go to the police station down the road.
And it's much more complicated than that. Obviously, when there's threats of violence, intimidation, coercion, indoctrination, there's many ways in which that person is forced to stand in that situation. And I visited a safe house last week, run by the Salvation Army, who do absolutely exceptional work in this area. And there were several survivors of modern slavery there who were telling their stories to me and other people from the Anti-Slavery Collective. And all of them came to the UK on the promise of a job. And that job didn't turn out to be the job that they were sold. So, for instance, there was a woman who was sold into, she was sold a dream of a job in a care home, a managerial role, and she was forced to work on a cannabis farm in a 4-bedroom house housing nearly 30 people in extremely abject, degrading conditions.
Whereabouts?
Near Leicester. And there was no escape. She was told immediately on arrival that she was owed £45,000, and that every single penny that she would make from now onwards would go towards paying off that debt. And you're talking about somebody whose passport is almost always confiscated. They're not given access to any documentation. They can't keep records. So when it comes to being rescued, they simply don't have the evidence to show that they were a victim of modern slavery.
It's very difficult then to prosecute anybody. It's all anonymous. Yeah.
Exactly. So the burden of proof is really very challenging for these individuals, especially if they've been kept in a situation where, there's been threats of violence. They are, there's a major problem with trust of authority. I mean, I knew a case, somebody told me about a woman in the Netherlands whose traffickers would organise visitations of other traffickers pretending to be police officers who would brutalise her, so that she would never go to the police, because in her mind...
And also, I suppose the other factor is they're feeling vulnerable because they're illegal immigrants.
Exactly, and that issue has been very... It's become very grey in the UK at the moment, and they are two very, very distinct things. Modern slavery is very distinct from someone coming in as an immigrant to the UK. It's a situation of extreme exploitation, not just somebody looking for work.
Okay, so we talked quite a bit about Britain. Can we just go wider to Commonwealth countries? I understand that India has a big problem.
Yes, I mean, as a hugely populous country, I think. There is an organisation called the Walk Free Foundation, and the Walk Free Foundation are responsible for running the Global Slavery Index, which is the most reliable data set we have on modern slavery. And their figures showed that last year, 11 million people in India were living in modern slavery. That's the most of any country in the world. I mean, they are the second most populous country in the world, but still the numbers are pretty shocking.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking to Barrett Lull a little bit about that later. But so why, obviously India's a huge country and there's going to be a lot of informal economy in there. Are they doing enough to try and clamp down?
There's a lot of good stuff going on, but I think the root causes of modern slavery are poverty, inequality. I think climate change is now having a really big impact on modern slavery because people are moving to look for work. And it's at that moment that their vulnerability spikes, because that's the moment when traffickers can recognise that they can be absorbed into modern slavery.
Right. Okay. So, what successes have you had? If any, it sounds like one of those problems that's incredibly difficult. It's all interconnected. It's international. It's underground. It's invisible. Where do you even start?
There definitely have been successes, and I think the successes that I've seen have been mainly issue-based or country-based. And I think because it's such a huge problem, and there are so many definitions of modern slavery: domestic servitude, forced labour, forced marriage. These are wildly different problems with very different drivers. If you take forced labour and then compare it to forced marriage, completely different topics, completely different issues.
And also male-female, right?
Exactly. I mean, modern slavery is very gendered. Commercial sexual exploitation, the figures globally, 98% women and girls in commercial sexual exploitation. If you go to forced labour, they don't kind of reverse, but it's the majority of men. So I think it is worth recognising that the gendering of modern slavery is significant, and therefore the solution and the tactics to tackle it also need to have a really sharp gendered lens.
Okay, successes.
So, I mean, if you look at, say for instance, the Philippines, they've had huge problems with commercial sexual exploitation, with a very, very focused effort of local organisations and experts in law enforcement and access to justice, and a supportive government. They have seen numbers drop enormously, to the extent where the NGO partner has moved out and the government have taken on this role, because they've seen such extraordinary results that have had economic impacts as well, positive economic impacts. And I think that goes to show how important it is to be laser focused about the form of modern slavery that you're seeking to address, the drivers, and then the appropriate tactics to tackle those drivers.
So how have they done it?
Coordination, sharing of information. There has to be political will, and there has to be a strong legal framework. But they have to have those conditions for that work to actually have an impact.
And are you saying that the political will often isn't really there?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, some of the issues we've discussed today, there are so many issues in the world. There's climate change and poverty, inequality. I think people have fatigue about social issues and injustice.
Plus they don't vote, let's face it. So it can sort of easily be forgotten, can't it?
It can, and I think most people have a really visceral picture in their head of what historical slavery looked like. And I think most people don't have the same idea of what modern slavery looks like, and it is manifested in very different ways. But it's the same thing, it's just not legal now. That's really the only difference. The same conditions are there. Okay, there might not be chains in every circumstance, but there are psychological chains.
And huge trauma. I imagine the people coming out of this, they're traumatized for life.
They are, and I think that's another incentive to tackle the root causes, because rehabilitating survivors of modern slavery is incredibly costly. It takes a huge amount of time, especially those who are caught up in commercial sexual exploitation. It's profoundly traumatic, and that abuse lives with these survivors for years. So I think there is some really, really strong work. Some of the safe houses in the UK that I visited, the Salvation Army, Bakita House, these are just astonishing organisations that are run with compassion and empathy at their core. And they're doing incredible work, but they would, I think, be delighted to be out of a job. It would be much easier if we could work and focus effort and investment on tackling the root causes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah, very much. I see Alita hovering.